Morning, Westside. Well, when God designed us, he seems to have been very intentional about the role of eyesight, our vision. He seems to have connected our eyes with our hearts in such a way that we tend to be shaped by what we see. Have you noticed this? Have you picked up on this? It's obviously something a person needs to be careful with and aware of in this age of social media and digital images and zillions of videos on demand at every second, right here in my pocket, right? That's a warning. Heads up, what you take into your life through your eyeballs will shape you. That's a warning. But I also think that God intends for that to be an invitation. And it seems God intended it to be this way. They say that about 70% of the sensory receptors in your body are dedicated to your eyes. That leaves only 30% for all your other senses. That's your sense of smell and taste and hearing and feeling, and that sense that your kids are up to something in the other room when the house is just a little too quiet, 70% dedicated to your ability to see. That's wildly out of proportion. It's a remarkable process that's way over my head. Cells in your eyeballs are designed to collect all of these signals of light and color and shape, and then somewhere in your noggin, another team of cells is translating those signals into images, which are kind of projected onto a kind of movie screen in your visual cortex. 40% of your cerebral cortex is dedicated to processing and making sense of visual information, which is what makes it possible for those who are blind, whose eyesight doesn't function properly, to create mental maps of their environment in their brains using their other senses that are compensating. God designed us, wildly designed us to be able to see and even be shaped by things that we've never actually seen with our eyeballs. God seems to have placed just a load of importance on vision, our ability to see, our ability to hold images in our minds, possibly precisely because he can so powerfully shape us through them. It is striking to me that as foundational, as essential, as central as the resurrection is in the Christian story, the whole purpose of the Christian life, what the church has always been about, how pivotal the resurrection is, not just in the life of the church, but in the universe, cosmically. It is striking to me that the image that most consistently throughout history has been used to symbolize the church community has not been the image of the empty tomb, but rather it's the image of the cross. You might be wearing it around your neck right now. We're wearing it over here on our wall. And if you know where this symbol comes from, if you grew up in the dark corner of human history that this instrument of torture and execution emerged from, you'd probably get chills every time you saw a cross. The Romans devised crucifixion, of course, to be not only a most excruciating kind of death, but also a most humiliating one. As a person hung on a cross, stretched out, either hanging there by way of ropes or by nails, spikes, their chest wouldn't be able to stretch out and take in a sufficient amount of air. And so over time, as the body weakened, they would not be able to take breaths. And so their body would slowly expire and they would die from lack of oxygen. All of this, of course, in front of a crowd, as if on a stage. The cross functioned as a public shaming, making it clear that this is what happens to those who aren't loyal to Rome. Rome's emperor, right? There's just so many ways to see the cross of Christ, so many different lenses through which to view it, so many converging strands and threads of meaning that supply its significance. The New Testament actually offers dozens of these. First of all, the cross, as you probably already know, is obviously this fantastic setup to Easter's victory, right? Jesus' victory over death. And it's also the cross, his death is also a victory in itself. Paul calls the cross a victory over the spiritual authorities that rule over us. The cross of Christ puts them to shame. The cross, of course, is a picture of God's forgiveness of our sin, of God paying the price for our sin. The cross is the way we get freed from sin's bondage when God breaks the chains between our hearts and the idols that we've given our hearts to. The cross is the shape of a disciple's life. As we follow Jesus, as we surrender our desires in exchange for his, what he wants, as we follow him, that's the cross way of living. The cross is a picture of humility and servanthood, a way of putting other people before ourselves. The cross is a picture of God's hatred of the sin in our lives that separates us from him. And of course, the cross is a picture of his love for us, his love for his kids who have been separated from him by our sin. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the four gospel authors, each presenting in their gospels a portrait of Jesus' crucifixion. And each portrait has different shading, different colors, each offering a slightly different perspective with different emphases, offering a different lens through which to view and understand his crucifixion. Mark was probably the first of the four to write his gospel. He sees the cross through the lens of Jesus' kingship. That's one of his main lenses. He sees Jesus as this king who came not to be served, but rather to serve, to give his life as a ransom for many. So Mark has Jesus hanging on a cross looking like a servant king. John was probably the last written, which gave him the benefit of having the most time to kind of process all of the various theological threads woven through the crucifixion. And John sees the cross through a lens of Passover. So in John, you see Jesus as the ultimate Passover lamb, freeing God's people from sin and spiritual bondage. Matthew, along with Mark, sees the cross through the lens of Psalm 22. You remember that song, that old prayer song to God that opens with that classic line, my God, why have you forsaken me? But it doesn't end there. It doesn't end in despair. It ends in celebration of the God who has not hidden his face, who has heard the psalmist's cry for help. And then there's Luke. Love Luke. Borrowing a lot of material from Mark, to be sure, but also weaving in other eyewitness sources. Luke is clearly aware of Psalm 22. But he's got another passage, another image in mind that just seems to dominate his view of the crucifixion. And Luke's pretty upfront with it, actually. Luke shows you his hand in this little story in chapter 22 of Luke. It's just before everything starts to get ugly. Jesus can sense it all coming down the pipeline at him. He's had his last meal with his disciples. He's wise to Judas's behind the back scheming. And Jesus' suffering and death is blowing in quickly like a storm on the not distant horizon. And he's on his way to the Garden of Gethsemane with his disciples, where he's going to go pray his guts out to the Heavenly Father. And before he gets there, he has this brief little conversation with his disciples. He's like, fellas, hey, you remember that time that I sent you guys out to preach the kingdom, and I told you to pack light, and that you didn't need to worry about that because you'd have everything you needed? They're like, yeah, we remember. Like, well, no more packing light, all right? Tonight, we need you packing swords. We need some swords. Here's why. There's a line from the prophet Isaiah that's about to be fulfilled in my life. It goes like this. He was numbered with the transgressors, He was counted as one of the criminals. You remember that line? They're like, yeah. Well, it might help for us to look a little bit more criminal, like a band of revolutionary rebels, right? One of them was like, Jesus, I got a couple swords over here. Jesus says, that'll do. Let's go. Then they head to the garden. And it all happened so quickly that those already freaked out disciples just totally missed what Jesus was saying, that Jesus had just told them that he's got to go fulfill Isaiah 53. Had they caught it, their minds might have just exploded right there on the spot. I mean, do you know what Isaiah 53 says? Or rather, do you know what God spoke through the prophet Isaiah 700 years before this moment? He says this, God says, behold, my servant will succeed. He will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted. Kings will shut their mouths because of him. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain, like one from whom people hide their faces in shame. He was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, he didn't open his mouth. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. I will give him a portion among the great, because he poured out his life unto death and was numbered with the transgressors. And just in case you need to see what that looks like in full color, Luke's got you. Fast forward through an illegal sham trial with religious leaders. Jesus is now standing before Pilate. That's the Roman governor put in place to keep the peace there in that region. And the religious leaders are trying hard to convince Pilate that Jesus is a treasonous insurrectionist who deserves death, capital punishment, which Pilate could make happen. But Pilate's not buying it. So he calls together all these religious leaders and the crowd, and he says, listen, you brought this man to me, accusing him of leading a revolt. I've examined him thoroughly on this point in your presence, and I find him innocent. Herod, as big of a buffoon as Herod is, even Herod came to the same conclusion and sent him back to us. Nothing this man has done calls for the death penalty, so I'm going to have him flogged, and then I'm going to release him. But those religious leaders, they wanted Jesus dead. And they had one last bargaining chip in their pocket with Pilate. See, it was Passover time. And just to keep the peace, Rome occasionally threw the Jews a bone at Passover, releasing a Jewish prisoner sitting on death row, pardoning whatever crime he'd committed. And so the crowd and its leaders decided to go for it. A mighty roar rose from the crowd. Kill him, kill Jesus, and release Barabbas to us. And Luke says Barabbas was in prison for taking part in an insurrection in Jerusalem against the government and for murder. See, Luke's making it crystal clear here, isn't he, that Barabbas was a bad dude. He actually was a criminal, having actually murdered someone, having actually participated in an actual insurrection against Rome. His crime was justly tried, his punishment fairly set. He was about to get what he deserved until someone completely innocent of any crime entered the picture. Pilate argued with all of them. because they wanted to release Jesus, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." For the third time, Pilate demanded, "Why? What crime has he committed? I found no reason to sentence him to death, so I will have him flogged and then I'm going to release him." But the mob shouted louder and louder, demanding that Jesus be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate sentenced Jesus to die as they demanded, as they had requested. He released Barabbas. And just in case you forgot who Barabbas is, Luke mentions he's the man in prison for insurrection and murder. Man, it's hard not seeing this play out through Barabbas' eyes, isn't it? I mean, can you imagine seeing this unfold? You know, you are guilty as charged. And you don't know much about this Jesus guy, but all evidence seems to point to the fact that this guy is innocent. I mean, Pilate himself is arguing with the crowd, with the mob, about his innocence. Jesus is simply standing there on the platform, silent before his shearers. I love those lines from Judah Smith. He says that Barabbas might have been tempted to think that it was the crowds who got him released, or that Pilate was the one to pardon him. No. It was the love of God who freed Barabbas on that day. Jesus silently standing there on that platform with eyes that were in full agreement with that mob, with that crowd. And he's saying, yes, free Barabbas. Kill me, take me instead of him. Yes, he is guilty as charged, but I love him. I love Barabbas. So let me die in his place so that he might go free. That's our story too, isn't it? We're standing up there, guilty as charged, about to receive the outcome we deserve, and Jesus steps in to take our place. The punishment that brought us peace was placed on him so that we might walk free. Luke says 2 other criminals, which quite possibly might have been Barabbas' partners in crime, were let out to be executed with Jesus. When they came to a place called the Skull, they nailed him to the cross. And the criminals were also crucified, one on his right, one on his left, so that he might be numbered with the transgressors, right? And Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing." The soldiers gambled for his clothes by throwing dice. The crowd watched and mocked, and the leaders scoffed. "He saved others," they said. "Let him save himself if he really is God's Messiah, the chosen one." Of course, one of the criminals hanging beside him chimed in, scoffed. "So you're the Messiah, huh? Why don't you prove it by saving yourself? And while you're at it, why don't you save us too?" But the other criminal protested. "You crazy? Don't you fear God? Even when you've been sentenced to die, we deserve to die for our crimes, but this man hasn't done anything wrong." That is a remarkable exchange on these crosses, isn't it? And this criminal, fascinating cat. This criminal's perspective of Jesus is super limited, super narrow, and yet he could still see Jesus' innocence. I mean, what exactly is this criminal going off of? What evidence did he have to work with? I suppose that the crowd, this mob, was actually supplying the basics of the narrative. The man had actually saved others with his powerful miracles. And if he did that, why couldn't he save himself right now? Why isn't he doing that? Meanwhile, a sign is spelled out over his head that says, "King of the Jews," Messiah. And when you combine all of that with the whole demeanor of Jesus, he's praying to God to forgive those who hate him. His whole approach to being killed, even though he's innocent. This is not how a guilty man dies. This might just be, this criminal thought, the death of a truly innocent king. What if this is a crucified Messiah? That would be spectacular if a criminal were the first one to see him in that way. He says this. He says, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus replied, I assure you, today you will be with me in paradise. Jesus put himself up there on the cross with the transgressors so that those transgressors, you and me, might be with him in his life. And then, of course, came the moment of death, the moment that this whole broken creation had just been careening toward throughout history. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all three mentioned the darkness in the sky that afternoon. And they all three mentioned the temple curtain. You remember that thick fabric that had for centuries separated God's holy presence from the rest of creation. That curtain miraculously tearing from top to bottom, marking the end of the whole temple system. Because the final, the ultimate sacrifice was being laid on the altar. Matthew is the one who mentions some of the more extraordinary phenomena. An earthquake, rocks cracking, tombs splitting open, and some of the righteous dead raised and walking around, being seen as a kind of glimpse of the very end of human history brought near. Luke doesn't mention any of those phenomena, but he ends the scene more simply, more quietly, except for Jesus shouting here. Jesus shouts, Father, I entrust my spirit into your hands. And with those words, he breathed his last. When the Roman officer overseeing the execution saw what had happened, he praised God and said, surely this man was innocent. The way Luke tells the story, you've got all these scoundrels in the story. They can see what's going on. Herod and Pilate could see Jesus' innocence. The criminal on the cross could see it. And now here's this Roman soldier, no friend of any Jew, make no mistake. This guy's just following orders. Another day, another dollar here at the crucifixion site. He doesn't care about any of these guys dying on these crosses. They're all the same to him, but this one, the way he died is just different. So different, in fact, that this Roman soldier praised whatever God he knew, saying, surely this man, whom I just helped kill, surely he was innocent. Whew. How crazy is that? What would it take for a Roman soldier to conclude that a condemned Jewish criminal were innocent? What was it about this death that struck this soldier in that way? Was it the ease with which Jesus died, the effortlessness? Was it the speed? John notes how relatively quickly Jesus died. Usually it took days to die on a cross. Jesus died in a handful of hours. Didn't even need to break his legs to speed up the process. That could be an indication of how badly they scourged him beforehand. Or perhaps he simply wasn't clinging to his life like all the rest. And that's what this soldier sensed. It's what he saw. This soldier had seen hundreds of criminals breathe their last breath. He'd killed hundreds of people, but maybe this was the only one he'd ever see who was giving up his life, laying down his life for the sake of the world and that Roman soldier nearby. And when that Roman soldier saw that up close with his own eyes, it changed him. To be that close to that kind of self-sacrifice, that kind of love, it changes a person, doesn't it? How close have you been to someone who is giving up their lives for your sake. How close have you been to it? I have 3 friends who have served our country who come to mind when I ask that question. One has been wounded by, I forget how many gunshots and shards of shrapnel into and through parts of his body. I know he's on his 37th surgery now, each procedure related in some way to his service, his willingness to sacrifice his body for our sakes, for my family's sake, for me. Another friend comes to mind. His wounds aren't as physical as they are psychological. He still, years later, wakes up with nightmares, recalling the horrific choices he had to make in order to protect the men in his unit. His willingness to sacrifice that part of his mind for our sake, for my sake. It feels very close. There's another friend. I remember him asking me to pray for him just a few days before he was deployed overseas into a conflict zone. Just a couple days before he'd say goodbye to his wife and kids. In that moment, it felt very close. I was close to it. And I remember after praying for him, I did manage to choke out through the tears a thank you for your service, knowing that he would soon be risking his life on my behalf. How close have you been to it? Perhaps you've been even closer than I. Proximity to that kind of self-sacrifice, that kind of love, it changes a person, doesn't it? It breaks a heart right open. During World War II, the Japanese captured a number of British troops, holding them captive in a POW work camp along the famous River Kwai in Thailand, and forcing them to help build the famous Thai-Burma Railway through the jungle. And the conditions of the camp were absolutely brutal, almost indescribably horrific. Death was the norm. Life was the exception. The goal of the Japanese soldiers was to break down the prisoners in every way, physically, psychologically, socially, into the worst possible human state. And they succeeded, at least initially. The cruelty of the guards, combined with all this wretched food when it was available, combined with the ceaseless, endless labor, dangerous workload, and all these jungle diseases, left the prisoners in this subhuman state. And they lived out of that state toward each other. So that the only attitude you could find among those in the camp was this malicious dog eat dog, every man for himself and forget the others kind of mentality. They pillaged their dead. They stole from each other. The men had become beasts. Until one afternoon, when a shovel came up missing. And after comparing the number of shovels to the number of prisoners who were present, a Japanese officer quickly concluded that someone from the group was attempting to steal a shovel in order to escape. So the officer lined up all of those prisoners, and he furiously demanded that whoever stole the shovel needed to step forward, or he would begin executing every one of them until the end of the line. No one budged. Then the officer pulled out his pistol, making it very clear he wasn't messing around. And before he pulled the trigger, someone stepped forward and said, "I took the shovel." The officer put his pistol back, grabbed the shovel, and beat the man to death right there in front of the other prisoners. The prisoners carried the man's body with them to the next tool checkpoint, where they discovered that there never was a missing shovel. The officer had miscounted the shovels. This man hadn't stepped forward to confess his theft. He stepped forward to save their lives. It became clear. And that single act of sacrificial love passed like a wave over the prisoners, rippling through the whole camp. Couple Christian prisoners, a Catholic and a Protestant, through their smaller, simpler acts of selfless love and mercy toward the other prisoners, nurtured a spiritual hunger among the camp, and it grew and it spread. And the Spirit of Christ began turning these beasts back into men as an appreciation for truth and beauty and goodness emerged in that most unlikely place. Prisoners pulled out books that they'd been stashing for a long time, hidden, and they started sharing their books with other prisoners. And they developed actually a book loan system, a library, which then turned into a few people teaching classes. And they established an open-air church and held services. They established a theater, which included a ballet performance. They developed an orchestra with bamboo instruments. And most notably, many of the prisoners actually forgave their Japanese captors. Jesus' kingdom flourishing right there in the middle of the jungle, otherwise surrounded on every side by hell. So each act of selfless, sacrificial love, large and small, carried out in this world we're living in right now, points us to the ultimate act of sacrificial love. When Jesus stepped into the line of fire, taking on the penalty for our sins and the sins of the whole human race. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. And whenever his disciples, who have received this tremendous gift, let it enter, then let it shape their lives. When they turn around and live out that same kind of self-giving love, their acts, large and small, bring Jesus into focus. As Paul says, we carry around in our bodies the death of Jesus so that this world might see his life.